गर्दन हिलाते हैं, थोड़ी सी एनर्जी लगती है. My estimation is that one calorie, and you can do it in both. You can do it like this, and you can do it like this, and give you a signal. Or both direction. You confuse me. So this particular process of digital analog to digital conversion provides the opportunity of increasing the sensitivity. That we all understand sensitivity increases when you have a larger magnet. Discuss so-called pulse NMR spectroscopy, in which you have multiple of experiments and you increase signal to noise ratio. I want to tell you another thing, and this is purely software independent manipulation to improve the sensitivity. Yesterday I asked you a question that where is the head of an FID, and this is the tail of, right? The most reliable part of information is in the head of the FID, and the tail of the FID has lots of contribution because the signal has decayed to get this very strong, which is a tail of your FID. Now, people have thought about it and said, in this data, this is your data set. This is your data set. Which part of the data is the most reliable part of the data? Head is the most reliable part of the data. And actually, this part of the data is the least reliable part of the data because it has lots of contribution of the noises of the electrons. And if I tell you that in the world of spectroscopy or in the world of anything, if you want to get a good result, you need to multiply the good data with a factor, and you need to divide the bad data with a factor in order to increase the contribution of a good data in the result and decrease the contribution of the bad data in the result. It's called weighing factor. It's called weighing. Remember, every person, every machine, every process has component of the good data and a bad data, right? Good data is the data in which you have most reliability, the content of information is maximum. The bad data is the part of the data in which you have least reliability and least content of the information. In order to increase the weight of the good data, you need to multiply it. And in order to decrease the contribution of the bad data, you need to divide it. So it's just a mathematical process which is called apodization. Somebody said 1967 used this particular approach, 67, when this whole concept of FID was slowly emerging. Can't we really make it more sensitive by reducing the noises, by multiplying with a factor which multiply this and divide this process, right? And this process is called apodization, the apodization. Very important process. In most NMR most spectrometer, apodization is a non-routine process and requires the intervention of an expert. But in bad NMR machines like in Shimadzu's or Jewel machine, they have automized this, which I don't clearly like. So apodization is a factor which you use use to increase the weight of the contribution of the good data in the end result. Is it clear to everyone? So apodization is a very important process, and you did do this apodization after ADC, because you can do mathematics only with the numbers, right? If you omit the contribution of 100% of this tail, you have two consequences. You reduce the noise to the minimum level, but you reduce the resolution to the minimum level also, because the finer structure on the head of the peak are because of very minute contributions of the FID. Remember, sensitivity and resolution compete with each other. You strike a balance in which you have a sensitivity and you have a good resolution also. Are you clear about sensitivity, difference of sensitivity and resolution? Very important concept. Sensitivity is sensitivity. How sensitive your equipment is, how sensitive your process is, how can you do what you can do to increase the sensitivity, so-called signal to noise ratio, or do an apodization to sensitivity. Resolution is, on the other hand, is a process in which you actually able to resolve the signal which are close to each other, so-called fine structures of the peak, couplings of the peak, long-range couplings of the peak, two peaks together which emerge as a very large sensitive peak. Resolution should be able to see them separately. Problem with the resolution and sensitivity, when you take out the data, this part of the data is called truncation. If you truncate, which is a very easy thing, what you need to do is you just need to turn off the detector. When you turn off the detector, you just record only this part of the FID. When you turn off the detector. When you turn off the detector, you lose this part, and you truncated the data processing. When you truncate, you don't have a contribution of the tail. If you don't have a contribution of the tail, you multiply this factor with an exponential data, you get an excellent contribution of a head and less head, smaller head. You get an excellent sensitivity. On the other hand, you lose your resolution. So there is, you need to strike a balance in which you have a resolution and a sensitivity optimized, and that is the art of doing NMR spectroscopy. NMR is not an automatic technique, always remember. It is a technique which requires lots of human intervention. There was a time when people used to think that X-ray is the most demanding instrument, but now people have made X-ray almost automatic for 99% cases. NMR remain technique in which human intervention extremely important, either for pulse calibration, which I told you yesterday, or shimming of your magnet, because you need to have a homogeneous magnet, or locking a particular solvent, or having a reference of a compound like TMS and other, or removing the so-called phase incorrections, all of these things. You need lots of intervention of a good NMR spectroscopist with all of these apodization. Apodization is one example in which you use different types of functions, Gaussian functions, exponential decay, a whole range of different. There are lots of different mathematical operations available which people are using in order to optimize the sensitivity by using only mathematical processes. Remember, whatever I would now discuss till the end, I would free myself from the hardware, because I have already discussed the hardware. Developing large magnet has been done. You already got a 1 gigahertz NMR machine. 1 gigahertz NMR machine. You already have a 1 gigahertz NMR machine. I don't know whether people would ever like to develop an 1100 megahertz machine because of a simple reason that when precision frequency is so extremely fast, it doesn't match with the radio frequency. You probably need to have a microwave or something else. So it could become entirely a different techniques for some nuclei. Maybe for some other nuclei may not be. Many confused here. See, when you have 1100 megahertz NMR machine, proton NMR machine, a big, huge magnet, superconducting magnet, you don't have radio frequency matching with the precision frequencies for proton. But it would remain be an NMR machine for carbon-13, chlorine, and other things which has lesser of precision frequency. So kindly remember, this is an interesting relationship. Time domain signal, Fourier transformation, mathematical technique which converts, not convert, a complex individual frequencies that add together to make it a frequency domain. Okay, very easy. FID converted into numbers. Fourier transformation become a frequency domain NMR spectrum, so-called conventional, more friendly looking NMR spectrum. And this is a mathematical process. So, for instance, if you have 6 FID of representing 6 protons, after Fourier transformation spectrum, you would have 6 different frequency bands. So that is what the individual frequencies have. So it is a process. Pulse Fourier transformation spectroscopy, as a reminder to you, kindly remember that it is a very fast technique. You have gone out of conventional NMR machine, in which you are spending tons of your time just to record baseline. And even if you have many spectra, you do a cumulative spectrum editing, it's remain a very insensitive technique. Signal to noise ratio not so good. But in pulse NMR spectroscopy, you irradiate all of them together, you record their FID, you do again irradiation, you again record FID, and you keep doing it. They call it scanning. Pulse is a process, experiment is separate. In the language of NMR spectroscopy, people do not really use word experiment because experiment is one, right? Okay. If you need to record a proton NMR spectrum which requires 32 times of pulses, 32 times, can be 64, it can be double of 8, it can be 7,000, it can be 8,000, 9,000, whatever. 32 times, every time you bring it, you bring a 90, you have a 90 pulse, you bring it to the XY plane, you record an FID, it goes back to the thermal equilibrium. This is one experiment, theoretically. Then you give another pulse, you bring it back. Then you record an FID, it goes back to the thermal equilibrium. Then you do every time, so you do 32. Now these are 32 experiments and you have 32 FIDs. 32 FIDs. You don't do your Fourier transformation on it. You just convert them all together, average them out, then do a Fourier transformation, then record a frequency domain spectrum. These experiments are not called experiments, called scanning. So there are 32 scans. Thoda NMR में one has to understand that people have modified the language. In reality, there are 32 discrete, distinct NMR experiments which you have performed because every time it has achieved a thermal equilibrium. Every time. And then you brought them back to the XY plane. Okay? But NMR spectroscopists call them scaling. So you can have 32 skein, you can have 64 skein, you have 6,000 skein, you can have 20,000 skein. Normal proton NMR spectrum is recorded with 32 skeins, and it's 8 skeins also. You can do it a high throughput NMR proton NMR spectroscopy also, in which you can have the lesser of these skein also. Carbon-13 requires in fact several hundred skein and sometimes several thousand skein because it is much more insensitive than proton NMR. And if you have a very large molecule like protein, you record 60, 70, 80, a million different skein in several weeks. To collect these changes. Actually, high resolution NMR spectrum and so-called high throughput dirty NMR spectrum फर्क है. High resolution NMR spectrum में I didn't want to confuse you, but let me do that. Thank you so much, Shina. She's my most humble and very respectful student. Okay, so in normal high resolution solvent NMR spectrum, liquid state NMR spectrum, you do one skein and then you wait for 5T1 time. This is what I want you to avoid. 5T1 time, 5 time it requires to relax, because you want to make sure that your magnetic gone to a real thermal equilibrium, and then you give the skein again. This is a standard skein, right? So in every experiment you wait for a while in order to ensure that even the slowest relaxing part of your molecule has relaxed back, because people have estimated that in a molecule the difference in relaxation is about 5 times. One relax back in 1 second, the slowest can relax back in 5 seconds. So you want to wait for about 5T1 time, big T1. This is a good NMR spectrum in which you get good resolution. In quick and dirty high throughput NMR spectroscopy, you don't really wait that long, because you're not really in high throughput NMR spectroscopy, you're not really elucidating the structure. The objectives are quite different. The objectives are whether it really is responding, the quantity is sufficient, whether it has an aromatic region, whether your whether a ketone has actually this small structure change which you wanted to do has actually occurred. You already know the structure. You're just going to use it for a low content of information called high throughput NMR spectroscopy. But in high throughput NMR spectroscopy, you need to do lots of changes in NMR hardware also, because the time it takes to change one tube of the best of autosampler, the time it takes to change one NMR tube, take it out and bring the other one is long. Therefore, you need to have a flow injection, direct injection, in which you just automatically injecting your sample, quickly going out of a system, another sample goes out of a system. So high throughput NMR is now becoming increasingly important for people who want to do high throughput work. For example, large multinational companies, large pharmaceutical conglomerates who want to screen 1 million compounds. Who cares? I mean, for us, it's not really important. That's why we never even thought of buying a flow injection. direct injection NMR spectroscopy. So it is quick and dirty. Quick and dirty. But it is a technique. Okay, so that's what we have done. We have accumulated FIDs, transients. FID को बहुत सारे name देते हैं. ये जो NMR के लोग हैं ना, they have a very special love of whatever they get. So they generally give a patname. FID is one patname, the other is called transient, the other is called interferograms. I don't know, so many. So in different NMR texts, you would find different names. Some people don't like to call it as FID. They call it as interferogram. Some use the word called T2 transient. So, but at the end of the day, rho is always rho. The idea of applying a sequence of pulses is of fundamental importance in NMR spectroscopy. This has really changed the fate of NMR spectroscopy because of the simple reason that the whole theorem understanding of NMR spectroscopy has changed from the bottom. From absorption NMR spectroscopy it becomes something different. The concept of pulse is introduced. The Fourier transformation theorem was introduced. Signal to noise ratios were improved by non-hardware approaches like bipodization, which I told you just now. So that's how you have actually, but you were able to do it by the development which was made by Richard Ernst, who got a Nobel Prize after 30 years of the pulse Fourier transformation. He has to wait for 30 years to get a Nobel Prize for an intervention which he has done in early 60s. Okay, but eventually he got it. This is pulse Fourier transformation. This is the 90 X pulse. Going back, this is your FID Fourier transformation. Here I want to take 1 minute to tell you that what actually happened. You see, when you bring longitudinal magnetization vector by a 90x pulse to the Y, and if you have a detector in front of it, you see a signal like this after Fourier transformation. If you bring the magnetization vector from this side to the minus x, see this type of a signal. And if you bring it here, you see a negative absorption. And if you bring it here, you get a negative dispersion. FID is a combination of all of it, because your spin is actually moving on xy plane. So the detector is actually seeing the whole of it. Assume that you have a detector outside and you are standing on a rotating disc. So the detector would see your face when you are in front of the detector. Detector will see your left shoulder and the back and the right shoulder and then front. It is exactly the same analogy. That's how you get a beat of this FID. Right? कोई इसमें confusion तो नहीं है ना? That's why it is important that one understand. And this is the first excitation, not very important. This is what I told you, this so-called composite FID, because you rarely have one type of proton in your molecule. You have lots of protons, lots of different protons. And when I say protons, it doesn't really mean that I'm talking about the number of protons. I'm actually talking about the type of proton. Electronic environment इनका different electronic environment. And you see a very complex FID like this. pattern remain the same and is a decaying signal, and therefore it is a time, you're recording time which is called small t2, acquisition time, reduction time, acquisition time, FID recording time, interferogram time, transient recording time. You can just name it, and then you do a free induction decay. So for a molecule like this, you get a three peaks after the Fourier transformation. I got uh, this picture of a conventional instrument. It's not the first generation of NMR. The first generation of NMR used to have a permanent magnet. This is a electromagnet, right? Electromagnet. The probe is in